The Reverend Green had been playing to a full house daily as long as the rain had been falling, and the rain had been falling for 2 weeks. When the kid ducked into the ratty canvas tent, there was standing room along the walls, a place or two, and such a heady reek of the wet and bathless that they themselves would sally forth into the downpour now and again for fresh air before the rain drove them in again. He stood with others of his kind along the back wall. The only thing that might have distinguished him in that crowd was that he was not armed. "Neighbors," said the Reverend, "he couldn't stay out of these here hell holes right here in Nacogdoches. I said to him, you going to take the Son of God in there with you? And he said, oh, no, I ain't. And I said, don't you know that he said, I will follow you always, even unto the end of the road? Well, he said, I ain't asking nobody to go nowheres. And I said, neighbor, you don't need to ask. He's a-going to be there with ye every step of the way, whether ye ask it or ye don't. I said, neighbor, you can't get shed of him. Now, are you going to drag him, into that hellhole yonder? You ever see such a place for rain?" The kid had been watching the Reverend. He turned to the man who spoke. He wore long mustaches after the fashion of teamsters, and he wore a wide-brim hat with a low, round crown. He was slightly wall-eyed, and he was watching the kid earnestly, as if he'd know his opinion about the rain. "I just got here," said the kid. "Well, it beats all I ever seen." The kid nodded. An enormous man, dressed in an oilcloth slicker, had entered the tent and removed his hat. He was bald as a stone, and he had no trace of beard, and he had no brows to his eyes, nor lashes to them. He was close on to 7 feet in height, and he stood smoking a cigar even in this nomadic house of God, and he seemed to have removed his hat only to chase the rain from it, for now he put it on again. The Reverend had stopped his sermon altogether. There was no sound in the tent. All watched the man. He adjusted the hat and then pushed his way forward as far as the crate-board pulpit where the Reverend stood, and there he turned to address the Reverend's congregation. His face was serene and strangely childlike. His hands were small. He held them out. "Ladies and gentlemen, I feel it my duty to inform you that the man holding this revival is an impostor. He holds no papers of divinity from any institution recognized or improvised. He is altogether devoid of the least qualification to the office he has usurped, and has only committed to memory a few passages from the good book for the purpose of lending to his fraudulent sermons some faint flavor of the piety he despises. In truth, the gentleman standing here before you posing as a minister of the Lord is not only totally illiterate, but is also wanted by the law in the states of Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, and Arkansas." "Oh, God!" cried the Reverend. "Lies, lies!" He began reading feverishly from his open Bible. "On a variety of charges, the most recent of which involved a girl of 11 years. I said 11, who had come to him in trust and whom he was surprised in the act of violating while actually clothed in the livery of his God." A moan swept through the crowd. A lady sank to her knees. "This is him!" cried the Reverend, sobbing. "This is him, the devil! Here he stands!" "Let's hang the turd!" called an ugly thug from the gallery to the rear. "Not 3 weeks before this he was run out of Fort Smith, Arkansas, for having congress with a goat. Yes, lady, that is what I said. Goat. Why, damn my eyes if I won't shoot the son of a bitch," said a man rising at the far side of the tent, and drawing a pistol from his boot, he leveled it and fired. The young teamster instantly produced a knife from his clothing and unseamed the tent and stepped outside into the rain. The kid followed. They ducked low and ran across the mud toward the hotel. Already gunfire was general within the tent, and a dozen exits had been hacked through the canvas walls, and people were pouring out, women screaming, folk stumbling, folk trampled underfoot in the mud. The kid and his friend reached the hotel gallery and wiped the water from their eyes, and turned to watch. As they did so, the tent began to sway and buckle, and like a huge and wounded Medusa, it slowly settled to the ground, trailing tattered canvas walls and ratty guy ropes over the ground. The bald-headed man was already at the bar when they entered. On the polished wood before him were 2 hats and a double handful of coins. He raised his glass, but not to them. They stood up to the bar and ordered whiskeys, and the kid laid his money down, but the barman pushed it back with his thumb and nodded. "This here's on the judge," he said. They drank. The teamster set his glass down and looked at the kid, or he seemed to. You couldn't be sure of his gaze. The kid looked down the bar to where the judge stood. The bar was that tall, not every man could even get his elbows up on it, but it came just to the judge's waist, and he stood with his hands placed flatwise on the wood, leaning slightly, as if about to give another address. By now, men were piling through the doorway, bleeding, covered in mud, cursing. They gathered about the judge. A posse was being drawn to pursue the preacher. "Judge, how'd you come to have the goods on that no account?" "Goods?" said the judge. "When was you in Fort Smith?" "Fort Smith?
Where did you know him to know all that stuff on him?"
"You mean the Reverend Green?"
"Yes, sir. I reckon you was in Fort Smith before you come out here."
"I was never in Fort Smith in my life. Doubt that he was." They looked from one to the other.
"Well, where was it you run up on him?"
"I never laid eyes on the man before today. Never even heard of him." He raised his glass and drank. There was a strange silence in the room. The men looked like mud effigies. Finally someone began to laugh. Then another. Soon they were all laughing together. Someone bought the judge a drink.